All
Yeah,
right.
like it's kind of relevant to what we're about to talk about because you can kind of see the thesis, antithesis, synthesis vague in the vague if you vague out this whole section of cognition. Like, I guess
Well, here's the thing. Things come in threes, all right, but it's not the threes that Fichte uh, would have put up. It's strictly it's the immediate being, and then essence, and then the actual category. The full notion comes in the third. That's not the same as saying synthesis. Blah blah blah. It's just
yeah,
that.
it's
Uh, you know.
funny. The closest thing you can get to that is where the antithesis comes out is internally from the thesis itself rather than being just externally, combined together. That's like
Yeah.
that's what I mean. It's like it's the most abstracted away from it. You can kind of see it when you fuzz a lot of this out, but then when you focus in, it goes away.
Yeah. Well, all right.
Come on.
Sorry.
Although I think this is right now, we're getting closest. This is probably the closest thing to like a more concrete definition of the dialectical method we're at. We're not obviously, these are not fully dialectical, period, but they're relating together that way, I guess, is my thought process on this.
Mm.
Because it's deriving the process out of the process in a way, right? Because it's thought understanding itself, so it's seeing its own thought process.
I'm starting to get to the point here. Let me reshare. Here we go. I'm starting to get to the point where even using the language of thought thinking itself um, can be misleading a bit because
Yeah.
um, our way of talking about this um, sometimes makes it sound like we're animating inanimate objects, and um, I don't know. I've lost my train of thought on that one, honestly. Um, yeah. So for the audience, we're going to talk cognition starting on um, now. So I'm going to go ahead and read 1677 and get things started. Um, uh, Life is the immediate idea, or the idea as its notion not yet realized in its own self. In its judgment, the idea is cognition in general. The notion is as notion for itself insofar as it freely exists as abstract universality or as genus. As such, it is pure self identity which inwardly differentiates itself in such a manner that the differentiated moment is not in objectivity, but is likewise liberated into subjectivity or the form of simple self likeness. And hence, the object of the notion is the notion itself. Its reality in general is the form of its determinate being, and the point of interest is the determination. This form, on this determination rests the difference between what the notion is in itself or as subjective and what it is when submerged in objectivity and then in the idea of life. Hang on just a second. All right, sorry about that. Okay, so he talks about life as the immediate idea, and cognition as judgment in the position of essence. And then he starts to talk about uh, Kyle. Is he talking about the notion here, or is he talking about the idea as a notion? The notion is as notion itself, as notion for itself, insofar as it freely exists as abstract universality or genius or genus.
I mean, in a way, it's
No, 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 no. He's backing way up to just the notion
okay.
because it's far less uh determined the way he says it.
Yeah, he's viewing it from two angles here again. Yeah,
Yeah.
because this is the doctrine of notion right here. So I guess so far, it's pure self-identity.
Okay. Okay. All right. Go ahead and read 1678, Kyle.
Okay, jeez, this is a little. There it is. In the latter, it is indeed distinguished from its external reality and posited for itself. Yet this is this its being for self, it's possessed only as a identity that is a relation to itself as submerged in its subjugated objectivity, or to itself as indwelling substantial form. The elevation of the notion above life means that its reality is the notion from liberated into notion form into liberated universality. Through this judgment, the idea is duplicated into the subjective notion, whose reality is the notion itself, and into the objective notion that is in the form of life. Thinking, spirit, self consciousness are determinations of the idea where it has itself for object, and its determinate being that is the determinant of its being in its own difference from itself. So I'm trying to think of the objective here is its determination is reflection at this point because it is referring back to itself as distinction from itself because it's subject looking at itself objectively, and then the initial subjective notion would be the subject itself. Yeah, I think that's kind of all he's trying to say right here.
Right.
It's just the subject itself still defining itself, and then the subject as reflected outside of its the objectification of itself.
Yeah. All right. Jim, 1679, please.
The metaphysics of the spirit, or as it was most commonly expressed, of the soul, revolved around the determination of substance, simplicity, immateriality, determinations in which the general idea of spirit, taken from empirical consciousness, was laid down as subject, and it was then asked, what predicates agree with our observations? This kind of procedure could get no further than the procedure of physics, which reduces the world of phenomena to general laws and reflective determinations, since it too was based on spirit merely in its phenomenal aspect. In fact, this procedure was bound to fall short even of the scientific character of physics.
Yep. So, moving on. Since spirit is not only infinitely richer than nature, but also its essence is constituted by the absolute unity of opposites in the notion. It exhibits, in its phenomenal aspect in relation to externality, contradiction in its extreme form. Consequently, it must be possible to adduce an experience in support of each of the opposed reflective determinations, or starting from experience, it must be possible to arrive at opposite determinations by way of a formal syllogistic reasoning. Pretty straightforward. Go ahead and keep reading, Kyle. Since the predicates immediately.
Yeah. The predicates immediately yielded by spirit's phenomenal aspect, in the first instance, still belongs to empirical psychology. There only remains, strictly speaking, for the metaphysical consideration, the wholly inadequate determinations of reflection. Kant, in his criticism of rational psychology, adheres to this metaphysics, insisting that insofar as rational psychology purports to be rational science, the smallest addition from observation to the general idea of self-consciousness would transform the science into an empirical one and mar its rational purity and its independence of all experience. So consequently, on this view, nothing is left but the simple representation I, a representation devoid of any content of its own, of which we cannot even say that it is a notion, but a mere consciousness that accompanies every notion.
Yeah.
Now, according to the further Kantian conclusions by this I, or if you like, it, the thing that thinks nothing further, is represented in a transcendental subject of thoughts, approximately X, which is cognized only through thoughts which are its predicates, and of which, taken in its isolation, we can never have the least conception. Now, two-paragraph paragraph.
Yep.
In this context, the I has the inconvenience to use Kant's own expression that we must already make use of it whenever we want to make any judgment about it. For it is not so much a single representation by which a particular object is distinguished, but rather a form of representation in general, insofar as this is to be called cognition. Now, the paralogism committed by rational psychology, says Kant, consists in this: the modes of self-consciousness and thinking are converted into notions of the understanding as applied to an object. That the I think is taken as a thinking being, a thing in itself, and that in this way, from the fact that I always occur in consciousness as a subject, and that too as a singular subject, identical in all multiplicity of representation, and distinguishing myself from the latter as from something external to me, the unjustified inference is drawn that the I is a substance, and further a qualitatively simple being, and a one, and something that has real existence independently of the things of time and space.
Thank you.
This, yeah, over abstraction. Because, yeah, okay.
Yeah. So starting from this, he says, uh, modes of self-consciousness and thinking are converted into notions of the understanding as applied to an object. That the I think is taken as a thinking being, a thing in itself, and that in this way, from the fact that I always incur in consciousness as a subject, and that too as a singular subject, identical in all the multiplicity of representation and distinct blah blah blah, from the latter as from something external to me. I as a substance is an unjustified inference, and further a qualitatively simple being, and a one, and something that has a real existence independently of the things of time and space. So what he's getting at here, in part, is Fichte's attempt to make the I, the I equals I, that's um, the I that's concrete. He tries to make the I abstract in order to make it universal. But, you know, you can't really do that, right? Because you're pushing the I back from its definition within the notion, where Hegel lodges it, back into essence as a substance. And he's saying, what I exists that's actually that indeterminate. He talks about this in like the opening chapters of either this book or the EL. But he talks about how Fichte basically tries to relocate the I back in essence. So that's what I think he's talking about here when he's talking about cognition. Jim, go ahead. We're with 1682.
I have drawn out this exposition in some detail because it shows clearly the nature of the previous metaphysics of the soul, and especially, two, the nature of the criticism by which it was made obsolete. The former aimed at determining the abstract essence of the soul. In doing so, it started originally from observation and converted the empirical universality of observation and the wholly external reflective determination attaching to the individuality of the actual into the form of the above-mentioned determination of essence. Kant, in his criticism, had generally in mind only the state of the metaphysics of his time, which in the main adhered to these abstract, one-sided determinations, wholly devoid of dialectic. The genuinely speculative ideas of older philosophers on the notion of spirit he neither heeded nor examined. In his criticism then of those determinations, he followed quite simply Hume's style of skepticism. That is to say, he holds fast to the I as it appears in self-consciousness, from which, however, since it is its essence to think in itself, that which we are to cognize, everything empirical must be omitted. Nothing then is left but this phenomenon of the I think that accompanies every representation of which I think we have not the slightest conception.
Yeah. Okay, Kyle. 1683.
Certainly,
Certainly it must.
certainly it must be conceded that we have not the least conception of the I, or of anything whatsoever, not even of the notion itself, so long as we do not really think, but stop short at the simple fixed general idea and the name. It is an odd thought, if it can be called a thought at all, that I must already make use of the I in order to judge of the I. The I that makes use of self-consciousness as a means in order to judge is indeed an X of which, as well as the relationship of such making use, we cannot have the slightest conception. But surely it's ridiculous to call this nature of self-consciousness, namely that the I that thinks itself, that the I cannot be thought without its being the I that thinks, an inconvenience, and as though there were a fallacy in it, a circle. It is this relationship through which, in immediate self-consciousness, the absolute eternal nature of self-consciousness, the absolute internal nature of self-consciousness and the notion itself manifests itself. It manifests itself for this reason, that self-consciousness is just the extant pure notion, and therefore empirically perceptible, the absolute relation to self as a separating judgment makes itself its own object, and solely this process whereby it makes itself a circle. Ooh, ooh.
Hmm. Right. A stone does not have this inconvenience. When it is to be thought or judged, it does not stand in its own way. It is relieved from the burden of making use of itself for this task. It is something else outside it that must give itself this trouble. Fun. Okay. I apologize in advance. I've read through this before, but it's been a while, and so I can't really make any draw any conclusions from any of this. I'm going to go ahead and read into the idea of the true here. The subjective idea is in the first instance an urge, for it is the contradiction of the notion to have itself for object and to be its own reality, yet without the object being another, that is, self subsistence over against it, or without the difference of the notion from itself, possessing at the same time the essential determination of diversity and indifferent existence. The specific nature of this urge is therefore to sublate its own subjectivity, to make its first abstract reality into a concrete one, to fill it with content of the world presupposed by its subjectivity. And you'll notice Lenin underlined this statement. From the other side, this urge is determined in the following manner. The notion is, it is true, the absolute certainty of itself, but its being for self is confronted by its presupposition of a world having the form of implicit being, but a world whose indifferent otherness has for the self-certainty of the notion the value merely of an unessentiality. It is thus the urge to sublate this otherness and to intuit in the object its identity with itself. This reflection into self is the sublated opposition, and the individuality which initially appears as the presupposed implicit being of a world is now posited as individuality and made actual for the subject. Accordingly, the reflection into self is the self-identity of the form restored out of the opposition, an identity that is therefore determined as indifferent to the form in its distinctiveness, and it is content. I have no idea what he just said there, Kyle.
Hmm. It's
Maybe I'm just tired tonight.
Hegel should have done diagrams.
Well, he's getting into the area where he's talking in general about cognition and its shape and how its moments made up from the previous categories of subjectivity as well as the entirety of objectivity, right? Being an essence is involved. And that's what he's doing. But you can get lost.
I think part of it is, I mean, we're talking about analysis here, right? So we're
Not
kind
yet. Not yet.
Kind
Right
of-
here, we're talking about Kant's critique of rational psychology. The idea of the true is what we're
Right.
talking about.
I mean, it's kind of the beginning of it, right? So it's kind of, I'm just trying to think, it's the way of trying to determine what the heck is in front of you is what analysis.
Right.
It's kind of what I'm getting out of that. It's just the urge to know what the heck is in front of you and give it an identity.
Yeah.
That's what I got out of that paragraph.
Okay. Oh wow. Okay, Jim. 1700.
This urge is therefore the urge to truth insofar as truth is in cognition, accordingly to truth in its proper sense as theoretical idea. Objective truth is no doubt the idea itself as the reality that corresponds to a notion, and to this extent an object may or may not possess truth. But on the other hand, the more precise meaning of truth is that it is true for or in the subjective notion in knowing. It is a relation of the notion judgment which showed itself to be the formal judgment of truth. In it, namely, the predicate is not merely the objectivity of the notion, but the relating comparison of the notion of the subject matter with its actuality. This realization of the notion is theoretical insofar as the notion as form has still the determination of subjectivity, or has still the determination for the subject of being its own determination. Between cognition is the idea as and the subjective, the negation of the world presupposed as an implicit being is the first negation. Therefore, also the conclusion in which the objective is posited in the subjective has at first only this meaning that the implicit being is only posited in the form of subjectivity or in the notion determination, and for this reason is not in that form in and for itself. Thus, the conclusion only attains to a neutral unity or a synthesis, that is, to a unity of things that are originally separate and only are externally so conjoined. Since therefore in its cognition the notion posits the object as its own, the idea in the first instance only gives itself a content whose basis is given and in which only the form of externality has been sublated.
Okay. Because cognition is the idea as and as subjective, the negation of the world presupposed as an implicit being is the first negation. Therefore, also the conclusion in which the objective is posited in the subjective has at first only this meaning, that the implicit being is only posited in the form of subjectivity or in the notion determination, and for this reason is not in that form in and for itself. So the sublation has occurred, but the subjective is not fully defined in and for itself, right? And basically, all this means is that we put together some of the pieces of subjectivity in its puzzle, but it's not its full whole yet, and so is only a set of moments of a greater, fuller subjectivity that it has not been made so yet. Something along those lines, yeah.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah. Kyle, 1701.
Accordingly, this cognition so retained its finitude in its realized end. In its realized end, it has at the same time not attained its end, and in its truth has not yet arrived at truth. For insofar as in the result the content still has the character of a datum, the presupposed implicit being confronting the notion is not sublated. Equally, therefore, the unity of notion and reality, truth, is also not contained in it. Oddly enough, it is this side of finitude that latterly has been clung to and accepted as the absolute recognition.
Yeah.
As though the finite as such was supposed to be the absolute. At this standpoint, the object is credited with being an unknown thing in itself behind cognition. And this character of the object, and with it truth too, is regarded as an absolute beyond for cognition. In this view of cognition, thought determinations in general, the categories, reflective determinations, as well as a formal notion and its moments, are assigned the position of being finite determinations, not in and for themselves, but finite in the sense that they are subjective in relation to this empty thing in itself. The fallacy of taking this untrue relation of cognition as a true relation has become the universal opinion of modern times.
Yeah. So basically, anything objective, meaning being in essence, are as a complete object that populates the subjective, it's completely emptied of that, right?
Doesn't
Yeah.
operate the Kantian thing in itself.
Yeah, exactly. So, yes, Kant deals with opposed notions that also, some of which also appear in essence. And he does, I think, deal with being, but as an entire objectivity, he just doesn't deal with it as a whole. That would sublate into the subjective, right? Something along those lines. They
Kind
remain they remain in their finitude. Yeah.
kind of things like God, the soul, free will cannot be cognized.
Yeah.
And Hegel's saying no.
Exactly. Okay.
They can be
Yeah.
cognized, and when you do that, you come out to a view similar to Spinoza's. Although Hegel wouldn't quite say that.
I think you would have privately.
Privately, yeah, not
Yeah.
publicly.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and read. From this determination of finite cognition, it is immediately evident that it is a contradiction that sublates itself. The contradiction of a truth that at the same time is supposed not to be truth, of a cognition of what is, which at the same time does not cognize the thing in itself. In the collapse of this contradiction, its content, subjective cognition, and the thing in itself collapses, that is, proves itself an untruth. But cognition must, in the course of its own movement, resolve its finitude, and with it, its contradiction. This examination of it by us is an external reflection, but cognition is itself the notion that is its own end, and therefore, through its realization, fulfills itself. And in this very fulfillment, sublates its subjectivity and the presupposed implicit being. We have therefore to consider cognition in its own self, in its positive activity. Since this idea is, as we have seen it, the urge of the notion to realize itself for itself, the urge to think, its activity consists in determining the object, and by this determining, to relate itself in the object identically to itself. The object is in general something simply determinable, and in the idea, it has this essential side of not being in and for itself, opposed to the notion. Because cognition is still finite, not speculative cognition, the presupposed objectivity has not as yet for it the shape of something that is in its own self simply and solely the notion, and that contains nothing with a particularity of its own as against the latter. Ow. But the fact that it counts as an implicit beyond necessarily implies that its determinability by the notion is a determination it possesses essentially. For the idea is the notion that exists for itself, is that for the idea is the notion that exists for itself, is that which is absolutely infinite within itself, in which the object is implicitly sublated, and the end is now solely to sublate it explicitly. Hence, though the object is presupposed by the idea of cognition as possessing an implicit being, yet it is essentially in a relationship where the idea, certain of itself in the nullity of this opposition, comes to the realization of its notion in the object.
Point where it comes aware it's the object in its brain is created by itself.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're back to reusing being in essence here, especially illusory being with essence.
Yeah. All right, Kyle, 1704 and 5, please.
Okay, yeah. In the syllogism whereby the subjective idea now unites itself with objectivity, the first premise is the same form of immediate seizure in relation of the notion to the object that we saw in the relation of end. The determining activity of the notion upon the object is an immediate communication of itself to the object in unresisted pervasion of the latter by the notion. In this process, the notion remains in pure identity with itself, but that its immediate reflection into self has equally determination of objective immediacy. That which for the notion is its own determination is equally a being, for it is the first negation of the presupposition. Therefore, the posited determination ranks just as much as a presupposition that has been merely found as an apprehension of a datum. In fact, the activity of the notion here consists merely in being negative toward itself, restraining itself and making itself passive towards what confronts it, in order that the latter may be able to show itself, not
Yeah.
as determined by the subject, but as in its own self.
Yeah. So he's oh yeah, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Accordingly, in this premise, this cognition does not appear even as an application of logical determinations, but as an acceptance and apprehension of them just as given, and its activity appears to be restricted merely to the removal of a subjective obstacle and external husk from the subject matter. This cognition is analytic cognition.
And it's a pretty good description. Suspend the subjective. This is why when you talk to analytic philosophers, even modern ones, they still, for the most part, rule out the presence of the subjective in analysis, and will fight you tooth and nail to say no, there's no observer involved. When of course there is. That's fascinating, isn't it? Let's see how long this thing is.
It wasn't too long. B gets silly long. I counted
Yeah.
B at like 25 pages. Or little b is like 25 pages. The synthetic.
Oh wow, yeah. All right, so how far do we really want to take this? Hang on a second. Well, we've got about 12 minutes left. Let's just keep going. We're not in any hurry. Who's next?
I think it's
think I am.
me, Jim, right? So Jim.
Okay, Jim. 1706 and 7.
We sometimes find the difference between analytic and synthetic cognition stated in the form that one proceeds from the known to the unknown, the other from the unknown to the known. But if this distinction is closely examined, it will be difficult to discover in a definite thought, much less a notion.
Yeah.
It may be said that cognition begins in general with ignorance, for one does not learn to know something with which one is already acquainted. Conversely, it also begins with the known. This is a tautological proposition, that is, that with which it begins, which therefore it actually cognizes is ipso facto something known. What is not yet known and is to be known only later is still an unknown. So far, then, it must be said that cognition, once it has begun, always proceeds from the known to the unknown.
I feel like I just listened to one of Rumsfeld's speeches.
Yeah, I was thinking
Yeah.
Rumsfeld.
Yeah. Okay. No, known knowns and known unknowns. Yeah. Kyle, 1708 and 9. Might
It
as well.
knows where it is because it knows where it isn't.
Yes.
The distinguishing feature of analytic cognition is already defined in the fact that it is as the first premise of the whole syllogism. Analytic cognition does not yet contain mediation. It is the immediate communication of the notion and does not as yet contain otherness. It is in the activity empties itself of its negativity. However, this immediacy of the relation is for that reason itself a mediation, for it is a negative relation of the notion to the object, but relation that annuls itself, thereby making itself simple and identical. This reflection into self is only subjective because in its mediation, the difference is present still only in the form of the presupposed implicit difference, as difference of the object within itself. The determination, therefore, brought by this relation is a form of simple identity or of abstract universality. Accordingly, analytic cognition has, in general, this identity for its principle. In transition into an other, the connection of different terms is excluded from itself and from its activity. Start turning into identity first. Yeah, that's what we always see in the logic pretty generally.
Hang on just 2 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's the same thing I've been seeing a lot. You got identity to difference, the moments of a unity of opposites that then become a new abstract universality that then differentiates, then realizes moments of a new unity. Yeah. Only way to process.
Okay. Sorry about that.
No worries.
All
Yeah,
right.
remember I was just saying in part, I think early on I was saying you have identity to difference, to moments of unity of opposites that itself becomes a new identity. Like as a vague sense. Seems to define this in a more concrete manner. The complexities of that, but I'm seeing that pattern here again.
Yeah.
I guess it makes sense because it's the only way to process. Okay. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, you're fine. 1709. If we look no more closely at analytic cognition, we see that it starts from a presupposed and therefore individual concrete subject matter. This may be an object already complete in itself for ordinary thought, or it may be a problem, that is to say, given only in its circumstances and conditions, but not yet disengaged from them, and presented on its own account in simple self-subsistence. Now, the analysis of this subject matter cannot consist in its being merely resolved into the particular picture thoughts which it may contain. Such a resolution and the apprehension of such picture thoughts is a business that would not belong to cognition, but would merely be a matter of a closer acquaintance, a determination within the sphere of picture thinking. Since analysis is based on the notion, its products are essentially notion determinations, and that too as determinations immediately contained in the subject matter. And I'll go ahead and read 1710 as well. We have seen from the nature of the idea of cognition that the activity of the subjective notion must be regarded from one side merely as the explication of what is already in the object, because the object itself is nothing but the totality of the notion. It is just as one-sided to represent analysis as though there were nothing in the subject matter that was not imported into it, as it is one-sided to suppose that the resulting determinations are merely extracted from it. The former view, as everyone knows, is enunciated by subjective idealism, which takes the idea of cognition and analysis to be merely a one-sided positing, beyond which the thing in itself remains concealed. The other view belongs to so-called realism, which apprehends the subjective notion as an empty identity that receives the thought determinations into itself from outside. Analytic cognition, the transformation of the given material into logical determinations, has shown itself to be two things in one. A positing that no less immediately determines itself as presupposing. Consequently, by virtue of the latter, the logical element may appear as something already complete in the object, just as by virtue of the former, it may appear as the product of a merely subjective activity. But the two moments are not to be separated. The logical element in its abstract form, into which analysis raises it, is, of course, only to be found in cognition, while conversely it is something not merely posited, but possessing being in itself. Hang on. Ooh. Okay. Jim, 1711.
Now, since analytic cognition is the transformation indicated above, it does not pass through any further middle term. Determination is insofar immediate and has just this meaning: to be peculiar to the object and in itself to belong to it, and therefore to be apprehended from it without any subjective mediation. But further, cognition is supposed also to be a progress and explication of differences, but because in accordance with the determination it has here, it is notionless and undialectical. It possesses only a given difference, and its progress takes place in the determination of the material. It seems to have an imminent progress only insofar as the derived thought determinations can be analyzed afresh, insofar as they are a concrete. The highest and ultimate point of this process of analysis is the abstract highest essence or abstract subjective identity and over against it diversity.
Okay, this progress is, however, nothing but the mere repetition of the one original act of analysis, namely the fresh determination as a concrete of what has already been taken up into the abstract form of the notion. This is followed by the analysis of it, then by the determination afresh as a concrete of the abstract that emerges from it, and so forth. But the thought determinations seem also to contain a transition within themselves. If the object is determined as a whole, then of course one advances from this to the other determinations apart, from cause to the other determinations of effect, and so on. But here, this is no advance, since whole and part, cause and effect, are relationships, and moreover, for this formal cognition, relationships complete in themselves, such that in them one determination is already found essentially linked to the other. The subject matter that has been determined as cause or as part is ipso facto determined by the whole relationship, that is determined already by both sides of it. Although the relationship is in itself something synthetic, yet for analytic cognition this connection is as much a mere datum as any other connection of its material, and therefore is not relevant to its own peculiar business. Whether a connection of this kind be otherwise determined as a priori or posteriori is here a matter of indifference, for it is apprehended as something found already there, or as it has already also been described as a fact of consciousness that with the determination whole is linked the determination part, and so forth. While Kant has made the profound observation that there are synthetic a priori principles and has recognized their root in the unity of self-consciousness, therefore in the identity of the notion with itself. Yet he adopts the scientific connection, the concepts of relation, and the synthetic principles themselves from formal logic as given. Their justification should have been the exposition of the transition of that simple unity of self-consciousness into these its determinations and distinctions, but Kant spared himself the trouble of demonstrating this genuinely synthetic progress, this self-producing notion. And I think this is where we're going to end. But what I want to talk about a little bit, really quick, from all of this, I think it was here in 1711 that it really kind of gels for me. Okay. Hegel's logic is organized starting from being, going into essence, and then finally the notion. But the efforts of philosophy to talk about cognition and how it works, especially on Kant's part, or previously in previous incarnations, you're really working backward with what they're doing. And so you have a philosopher, and he represents the absolute. And from the absolute, he begins to try to define what is objective in being, in essence. And basically, all previous philosophies try to define the categories of being and essence inadequately from their position in the subjective. Right here, he's showing how the analytic philosophy tries to look at being an essence while ruling out the subjective notion, even though that's the position that they're philosophizing from. Okay. And this is a problem because ultimately the conclusions that you're able to draw, if you have an incomplete picture, I guess, of the categories of being in essence and their interrelations, you arrive at a notion of cognition that is necessarily incomplete, doesn't contain everything, and what it's based on, especially in that last sentence, is based on what you found in a book as opposed to what you actually derived philosophically, right? And so they end up returning to cognition with shoddy material to define it after doing their analysis, if that makes sense. Like, I'm trying to picture how in my head, like, what this looks like. As it's happening. And, of course, the problem is how you deal with those objective categories has a consequence for the resulting notion of cognition. Yeah. Thoughts?
Just trying to kind of picture what it means, because it does make a lot of sense. It's positing, it's also a presupposing at the same time.
Yeah.
But I guess I'm just trying to think what that means together, because I feel like, that's obviously how we're going to make the next leap too, but I'm still trying to, what does that mean together? I guess.
Well, if you think concretely about the philosopher coming from a subjective position, and some of the philosophers rule in subjectivity into their notion of cognition, and some of it leave it out. The analytic philosophers leave it out, right? Or there's Kant, who says everything's subjective, and we can't really know fully what the objective can be. It's the thing in itself. So yes, the thing in itself and its determinations, being in essence defines cognition. We can't really get to the infinity of cognition. We can only look at the pieces finitely, I guess you could say, right? Because it's not like he rules out the objective as we're not able to get there. We're obviously able to look at it, but he says because of our subjectivity, our view of the objective is flawed. And so here are the broken pieces of the objectivity. Deal with it. And right at the end here, Hegel says, you know, Kant spared himself the trouble of demonstrating how they fit together and what their proper relation was. He left the categories of essence opposed to each other rather than related to each other properly, for instance. And so you can't really know the objectivity of subjectivity, right? You can only just go, well, you know, this is a fractured mirror. We can't really look into it properly because subjectivity taints it, I guess you could say, which Hegel says is absolutely not true. If you know the order and the relation of objectivity properly, which he defines here. He says, their justification should have been the exposition of the transition of that simple unity of self-consciousness into these its determinations and distinctions. Yeah. Define the subjective notion, position by its objectivity. But Kant wasn't able to even do that, which is actually kind of sad because he had the pieces in front of him. I don't know. All right, folks. It's 9:08 and I'm getting tired. But I want to suggest
Which I was going to say, are we going to skip next week? Which is the 23rd? Or is that okay?
hang on.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so yeah, I think honestly, we're going to take a break for 2 weeks, the 23rd and the 30th, because the 23rd, my parents are here, and I'm pretty sure they're still here the 30th. And Monday in the evening, I'm probably not even going to be here. I'm probably going to be at some hotel, maybe. Who knows? Hopefully. So let's. Do I even want to make an assignment?
I mean, we just continue along to the end of this chapter, right? Basically.
Okay, we're at synthetic cognition on 793.
Right.
Why don't we read through I mean it's 2 weeks. It's a lot. Sorry. Why don't we read through the end of the chapter just like Kyle said? It's I mean, it's roughly 30 pages, but 2 weeks, 15 pages a week, we can get to the end of synthetic cognition all the way to the idea of the good and finish it out. Does that sound pretty reasonable? And then we can have a general discussion. I'd really like to read it through long ways, but at the same time, I have the feeling we're going to be driving into January. Not finish until February, which would be okay too. But let's see how this goes. Since we're taking off 2 weeks and meeting back up on the 6th. On the 6th, we'll get together and finish out our discussion of the idea of cognition, just what was left. I'll make some notes and try to give a general presentation, and then we can talk about the rest of it. And then we'll jump into yeah, you got your nice hardback there, Mister. Uh, I love it.
Purpose.
I've still got my it's still good to go. I've read it through a couple times, and it seems to be holding up. So
Yeah, I know I did not luck out on that, but then I had to fail to win. So
yeah, oh, I know. All right, comrades. I'll be talking to you on DMs. But otherwise, have a nice holiday, and whatever you're doing. Um, Looking forward to see you on the 6th.